Welcome to Beyond My Crisis. I'm your host, Ron Rosnick.
And I'm Vivian Gaspar. We're fortunate to have with us here today Jessica Di Bianca. She's an attorney specializing in family law and victims' rights cases. She has a degree in psychology from Boston University and began her legal career in 2005 clerking for a Superior Court family judge. You have amazing credentials. Thank you so much for joining us here today to talk about, unfortunately, a very important topic that affects millions of people, men and women alike, domestic violence.
Thank you for having me.
So who are really the victims of domestic violence? Where does it span from?
Domestic violence does not discriminate. Domestic violence impacts adults of all ages and children of all ages, people of different socioeconomic backgrounds, ethnicities, races, and genders.
Give us an example of someone you might suspect isn't your typical victim.
Perfect example is your Harvard graduate, female, let's take a female for example, a Harvard graduate who's a Wall Street executive who is in a dating relationship with someone she loves. And that woman, unbeknownst to all of her family and friends, silently is suffering. And by that I mean she's suffering the same way that someone of any economic or socioeconomic class might be suffering.
So she is a well into six-figure earner. So she is not someone that someone would typically think that's low class or living in a destitute area. She's probably living in a wonderful home and driving a beautiful car, and she's still suffering.
Absolutely. She could have 3 or 4 kids. She could be driving the best car. She could have a perfect dog and a perceivably perfect life on the exterior. But what's missing is what's going on behind closed doors.
And how do you reveal some of those cracks? What do you look for?
Well, you look for some of the cardinal signs and symptoms of abuse. Domestic violence is not limited to physical abuse. And I want to be really clear about that. Domestic violence can be emotional, psychological, physical, economic.
What do you mean economic? What does economic have to do with domestic violence, especially when you're speaking about someone, in this particular example, who's a high income earner? How on earth could she be a victim of something that's an economic abuse?
And it's great that you asked about that, Vivian, because it's a topic that is not discussed as often, but is becoming more recognized by the courts and various organizations because it is a very real thing. So an example of economic abuse is, and it goes back towards the ultimate goal of perpetrators of abuse and domestic violence, which is to exert control and power over their significant other. So in the context of economic abuse, you will see a partner or spouse controlling all of the money. And by that I mean something as innocent as managing the finances, right? So on its face, it looks like no big deal.
Could be grocery shopping.
Sure.
Could be which car the family's going to buy.
Right. But where the abuse comes in is all of a sudden the perpetrator is telling the victim what he or she can and cannot spend. They may go so far as to purposefully put that individual into debt. They will scold the individual for going out and shopping. It can even further escalate by amounting to stalking because the person who is exerting this financial control over the other is monitoring the victim's every step. Mm-hmm. So the stalking component, which is also a crime of domestic violence, comes into play with monitoring someone's finances and financial spending.
Now, how would you say, how could your spouse be stalking you? You'd expect that it's a stranger stalking you, not your spouse.
You'd be surprised. There are individuals who will implement GPS tracking devices, whether it's through the car, tapping into, let's say, a car that has a built-in self-remote system, right? And a lot of cars nowadays do that. You can auto start your car, and if someone has your VIN number, which your spouse can easily get a card,
Yeah.
access to your insurance card, they all of a sudden
But
can
what's the
follow the card.
intent? So the intent
intent.
of finding where that person is because of what reasons?
To find out exactly where they are, what they're doing, how they're, and with economic abuse, how they're spending their money, where and why.
Because the spouse is suspicious of some activity, or they just are clinically paranoid? I mean, where does that come into play as abuse then?
It could be suspicion, but it's not limited to suspicion. Ultimately, it's control. They want to manage the finances. They're going to do everything that it takes to manage and control the finances and to control any other individual, particularly their partner.
So if someone feels they're a victim of this type of predatory action, what is the question they have to ask themselves?
What you have to recognize is, are you feeling guilt as a result of going out and spending because, for example, right after you get a phone call, right after you make a purchase, you get a phone call, oh, why were you just at Target? What were you buying? The credit card company called and they said that there was fraud on the card. And you're asking yourself, is this really happening, or is he convincing me that
So
this
undue
is happening?
scrutiny is one of the things that spouse needs to start being aware of.
I had a client who meets that scenario and fact pattern exactly. So she has family members who suffered from mental illness, and the spouse knew of that. And what the spouse did when the tensions got high, right? So the tension building phase is one of the initial phases of the cycle of violence. And during that phase, during any argument that may occur between the two of them, he would say, you know, you're just like your father. You're just like your father who had suffered from mental illness.
Mm-hmm.
And mental illness is a real thing and something that people don't necessarily understand and recognize.
Doctors still don't quite understand
sure,
it. So, yeah.
right. It's still.
You really want to sound like you want to push a button to make you feel the victim to feel, sensitive and insecure about themselves, questioning themselves. Is that what their intent was in this situation?
And it's great that you said intent, because it is all about intent. Yes, is the answer to that question. The purpose is to gaslight or ignite the flame to make you believe that you are crazy, because those are words that will come out of
Right.
the mouth of
And
these
when we're
perpetrators.
back, we're going to discuss more of what to do when you're a victim. We'll be right back.
Anytime you can come into court and file for a change if there's a change of circumstances. We give an hour free consult. It's confidential. Find out what has to be done.
Welcome back to Beyond My Crisis. We have Jessica Di Bianca here discussing domestic violence.
Have you had a lot of circumstances in your experiences where people need to make themselves a resource to a friend? Like, for example, they could stay with them because if there's financial control being exerted, they might fear homelessness more than being abused.
Yes, but unfortunately, a lot of times the victims don't take that opportunity to get out, escape, take some time off and pause, because they fear what will happen if they do, because they're still under the dominion and control of their husband or wife.
And they don't have a backup plan in place. If that victim, with their friends or with support, can formulate a backup plan, and I know there's organizations to help get housing for domestic violence victims and other things, but what can they do to get their backup plan in place?
First of all, the most important step is to realize that you do have a way out. And that takes a lot. You have to have a lot of strength and courage, and that can be through friends and mentors, but you really need to understand that you can get out. I've had clients who have been beaten over and over again, whose clothes have been ripped to shreds, who will call me in a panic and say, Jessica, I need help. I can't live like this anymore. I just want to die. I mean, such dire situations. And then a few weeks later, oh, I need to take a step back. I'm not going to call you for a little bit. He really loves me. We have a child. I don't have a job. What am I going to do? They have to recognize that, number one, if they are in a marriage, there is a way out. The courts do protect mothers with children. They're not going to throw someone out on a street. They can't, right? So you have to have the courage.
Right. The fear of change has to be overcome with your own courage. One, for your children's safety and health. That is often a catalyst for people to make that change.
Yes, and it should be, because children are adversely affected just as much as the abused spouse themselves.
When you talk about children being affected, what are some examples of long-term abuse? So let's say someone does manage to get out. They get divorced. Is it done? When the divorce is over, is their abusive situation finalized? Is it over then?
It can be, but not necessarily. Why? Because if you're dealing with a post-judgment, meaning after the divorce situation, and this happens a lot, where there's financial obligations that continue, there's custody arrangements that are in place. Oftentimes, someone who was an abuser is still not ready to let go and relinquish the control they had over their former partner.
Right, and we're going to talk more about that in the next section, about post-divorce and how we handle domestic violence after that. We'll be back in a moment.
We provide is the experience that physician assistant, our pre-PA students need. The success rate of our program of having students accept the PA school is 97%. All our students we have relationships with. Many of our students come back and help out. There's a lot of different challenges, but the students, we just do rapport with them, and they're like our children. They really are.
Welcome back to Beyond My Crisis. We're here with Jessica, who's an attorney helping people with domestic violence issues. Once they're in their marriage and separation is happening, that whole cycle is chaotic. What can they expect?
Well, in situations that I've seen where couples remain living together during the separation, that can be extraordinarily toxic. I don't recommend it for people going through, but it's oftentimes difficult to just pick up, move out, and risk fearing abandonment of your children and so on and so forth. So you have to set barriers. You really have to set barriers, because if you don't, it's going to be as toxic as an environment as you've ever seen. Because this is the process by which you're no longer united. Your relationship is ultimately going to end.
I'd like to know, what are some of the boundaries and barriers that you have to kind of set up for yourself, your children, and your soon-to-be former spouse or former spouse? What do you do?
If you're fortunate enough to be in an amicable situation, or the fuse has gone down a bit, you can try to work some of that out with your partner. However, if you're in a highly contentious divorce mixed with domestic violence, oftentimes you can seek an emergent order from the court that will put in place orders, directives, that sets forth who sleeps where, who uses what bathroom, and begins implementing a parenting time schedule that will prepare the children, if there are children of the marriage, prepare the children for ultimately what's going to be a shared custody arrangement, if there is one.
So use the court on an emergent order, which means it's going to happen immediately. Emergent is within 24 hours, you're going to ask to get in front of a judge.
And you need a basis to do that, right? So when the tensions are really high and you feel like the home is becoming so toxic, not only between you and your spouse or your partner, but the children are being impacted, that is a time where you need court intervention, because no one's going to help them unless you speak out.
And so I do want to make sure we talk about something that people, I know we started before, but it's really important. How does it continue post-divorce? Because when there are children involved, and let's face it, most people have kids, How does that continue? Because they sometimes don't want to let go. They might say, okay, we'll get divorced, and then realize they still want to maintain some variable of control, which they don't see themselves as abusers, but ultimately that's what it is.
And you see this even in situations where a partner or a spouse has already moved on, already has a new relationship. And as a victim, you think, okay, I'm off the hook. But that's not necessarily true. Again, and we touched upon this earlier, if there's a financial obligation that's attached, there's children, there's custody arrangements, and you have to reach out and communicate to your former partner or spouse, there's going to be tension still. And the person who once exerted so much control over you to the point that they wanted to destroy you, that's not going to just stop, especially if the perpetrator has not done their own healing and work.
And the perpetrator should be asked by the court to do what? Anger management or other classes. Is that normal? Does that happen?
It happens if the victim presses charges, and sometimes...
Now, what charges does the victim have to press?
So, if there's an incident, and I've had many clients who have had police come to the house after a dispute, whether it's physical, psychological, economic, threats of taking children away, all of that. Police will come to the house and they'll interview both the victim, alleged victim, right? And at that point it's alleged, and the perpetrator in separate rooms. They'll get a story. And what I've witnessed is if there's no physical violence that's going on, the police may suggest, well, I don't know if this is something that we could take seriously right now. You might want to pursue this civilly as opposed to criminally. But they do ask you, do you want to pursue a protective order or a restraining order, sometimes known as a no contact order. And what that would do is it would require you as the victim to go to a courthouse, and it takes time. And it's made very apparent to you that it's a timely, gruesome process. You have to go down to the courthouse, you have to wait a couple of hours to see a judge, and you have to press charges. And you have to prove that you were assaulted in whatever way, shape, or form. And that's just a temporary order that's in place.
That's called a temporary restraining order?
Correct.
Okay.
And that's not the end of it. That has to be served upon the perpetrator within a short period of time, and that person gets an opportunity to come to court and respond.
So we'll be right back. We're going to be talking with Jessica about what happens post-divorce and regaining your control of your life.
3.4 million children are investigated by Child Protective Services annually. Of the kids in foster homes, 75% were neglected, 17% physically abused, and over 300,000 sexually molested.
I decided to dedicate my practice to helping people and parents who have lost their children.
Attorney Vince Davis has brought thousands of families back together, and he will fight for yours.
Welcome back to Beyond My Crisis. We're here with Jessica Di Bianca talking about how domestic violence and marriage can be a new beginning for people. So after a domestic violence issue, after divorce, how do people regain their lives?
Again, don't blame yourselves, ask for help, and seek as many resources as possible that are available to you. And they come in various forms. You don't have to go to the most expensive psychologist or psychiatrist around or the most expensive lawyer around. You can seek, people who want a lawyer can get pro bono, free legal services. They can go to a local YMCA. They can go to a local police station, talk to a domestic violence counselor, and be guided in different directions. They can call hotlines. There's multiple resources available.
Now, regarding children, obviously support payments, financial support needs to be put into place. And I'm sure many people, even though they're getting divorced for perhaps domestic violence situations, reasonings, they are hoping to be amicable. That is a nice hope to have. What about if one of the partners might pressure the other partner to say, well, let's not go through probation. You could trust me. I'll make my payments. And you want to have good faith. Is that something you'd recommend that they go along with?
It all depends on the history. So if there's been economic abuse during the marriage, part of the control that carries over post-divorce is, well, I want to control every which way I can the finances of my ex-spouse post-divorce. And a way in which that sometimes is manifested and carried out is by convincing the victim that I'll take care of everything, but I want to pay you directly. I don't want to be embarrassed. I don't want to have to go through the probation system. I'm not a criminal. You can trust me. You know, it's part of that whole cycle, right? You rebuild and regain trust in your partner.
So just for clarity, probation in respects to post-divorce is probation for making alimony and child support payments.
That's correct.
Right? And that means that monies get paid directly to the state, and the state gives the money to whoever needs the money at that point.
That's correct, and it's a tracking system, right?
Right.
So,
would you recommend that?
absolutely.
100% of the time.
I would recommend it to the extent it's feasible, and I'll tell you why. It's in situations involving domestic violence, yes, I would recommend it, because you no longer have to be the monitor, the police of your ex-spouse. You don't have to call them the day before the first of the month and say, are you going to pay me my alimony and child support this month, because I'm not going to be able to make
that uncomfortable
my
moment
rent.
to
What
ask.
if they just want you to be uncomfortable? They want to make you suffer. Even if you've been divorced for a while, they can't stop wanting to make you suffer. Is that something that you've seen?
Yes, I've seen it repeatedly. I had a client who I was in court with for a final restraining order hearing, and her boyfriend showed up thinking I'm just her friend and not her lawyer, and he tried to manipulate me into making me believe that my client's crazy.
So what did he say? Like what?
Oh, the gaslighting thing, right? The crazy
Right,
claims.
and he was gaslighting me as her attorney.
But
So-
she didn't know she thought it was a friend that has influence over her.
Right.
Yeah.
Until he realized I was the attorney. And the
Right.
judge called us up, and I was ready to proceed with trial. He didn't have his lawyer with him, or any lawyer. It was his second time there. The judge was not adjourning that trial anymore. And he would ask the judge repeatedly, can I speak to counsel outside? Can I speak to counsel outside? And I agreed.
So he's so good at manipulating people, he just has enough hubris to think he can do it all the time, anytime, to get what he wants.
Sure, he sees a woman and he thinks, I'll treat her like my girlfriend. I'll manipulate her. She'll listen to me. She's weak. She'll concede to my demands, and that'll be it. And I stand firm. I fight for my clients, and I say, I'm sorry, I'm ready to proceed today. My client is ready to proceed. You can either take a plea or you can proceed with trial and take testimony. Your choice.
I'm sure the trial went well then.
He took a plea.
He did take a plea.
Well, congratulations on standing firm always for your clients.
Yeah.
I do always want to end our shows on giving people hope and recognizing signs, because I think the most important thing about domestic violence is reminding people there are clear-cut signs, and to even take note yourself, not just for your friends and your coworkers to notice about you if you're a victim. So can you please just remind us, what are some of the signs of somebody who's not even being physically abused? What are some key things or actions that an abuser will do to someone?
I've seen clients who have had their perpetrators kick dogs, scream at the children, have road rage, all sparked by the smallest things that their spouse and the victim may do or may say to them. Or maybe their spouse is dressed a certain way that they don't like. And all of a sudden, the kids are getting punished. There's no dinner cooked. They're driving erratically. They are economically controlling you. They're taking away your ATM card or your credit card. I mean, abuse comes in all forms. You don't need to see visible scars and bruises to be a victim.
Right, but getting over the abuse after this has all been established is the final phase. Like, do we give forgiveness to the abuser for our own sanity? How do we come to terms with it and just move on and end the chapter?
So abuse is ugly. Domestic violence is as ugly as it can be in every variation of it. So I think timing is critical. For your own peace of mind as a victim, I think it's up to you to determine when you are ready Just like when you're ready to leave the relationship, when you are ready to let go of what ultimately is resentment that you have toward that individual because of how they treated you. And if you're able to forgive or even acknowledge some of the ways in which you may have contributed to the demise of the relationship and apologize, that will start to set you free. And it's so important because resentment is toxic.
Resentment is toxic.
It's absolutely toxic.
Thank you so much, Jessica. This has been very eye-opening, and I'm really looking forward to all our viewers having a much better understanding about themselves potentially, or people in their lives, whether they be friends, relatives, or coworkers. It is always going to be about helping those you care about, loving yourself, helping your children, and getting beyond your crisis.